Veteran reunites with lost war horse after 5 years. But what it did next left everyone speechless. Captain James Mitchell stood at his kitchen window in Montana, his coffee growing cold as he stared at the old photograph on his refrigerator. The image showed a younger version of himself in military uniform, his arm draped around the neck of a magnificent black stallion named Shadow. The morning sun caught the frame, highlighting the horse's gleaming coat and proud stance. "Hard to believe it's been 5 years," he muttered to himself, running a hand through his graying hair. At 42, James still maintained his military bearing, though the limp in his right leg served as a constant reminder of his last deployment. Shadow had been more than just a military horse. Standing 17 hands high, the Frisian stallion had been specifically chosen for his intelligence, strength, and remarkably calm demeanor. What made him truly special was his expressive dark eyes that seemed to understand human emotions on a profound level. "Dad, you're doing it again," called Sarah, his 16-year-old daughter, as she entered the kitchen. Looking at Shadow's picture, James smiled weakly, just remembering. He turned to face his daughter, who shared his same determined jaw and green eyes. "You know, Shadow was the one who saved my life in Afghanistan." Sarah settled at the kitchen table, having heard pieces of this story but never the whole thing. "Tell me again, Dad, please?" James sat across from her, his coffee forgotten. "It was during a mountain patrol in 2018. Shadow and I were part of a specialized mounted unit, using horses to access terrain that vehicles couldn't manage. That day, we were checking a remote village when the insurgents attacked." He paused, lost in the memory. "Most horses would have panicked from the gunfire, but not Shadow. When I was hit in the leg, he stayed calm. Instead of running, he positioned himself between me and the incoming fire. Then, despite his own injury, he helped me get back to our unit. The medics said if he hadn't acted as he did, I wouldn't have made it." After James's injury and medical evacuation, Shadow had continued serving with the unit. Then, during a reorganization of military assets, the horse program was partially discontinued. Many of the horses were redistributed to other government agencies or put up for adoption. "I tried to track him," James continued, "but between my recovery and the military bureaucracy, I lost track of where they sent him. All I knew was that he'd been transferred somewhere on the East Coast." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed her father's hand. "Is that why you started the Veterans Equine Therapy Program?" James nodded. Working with horses had been part of his own recovery, and 3 years ago, he'd used his military pension and family ranch to establish a program helping other veterans heal through horse interaction. The program had grown successful, but there remained an empty stall in the barn, one he'd always hoped would someday house Shadow. "I keep thinking about those eyes of his," James said softly. "People who don't know horses might not believe this, but Shadow could cry. Not like human tears, but his eyes would get wet with emotion. The day they took him away," he trailed off, remembering the horse's confused, hurt expression. The phone's sharp ring interrupted the moment. James answered, his expression changing as he listened. "Are you sure?" he asked, standing abruptly. "A black Frisian, with a white star marking on his chest. And you found my contact through the Military Service Animal Registry?" Sarah watched her father's face transform as he scribbled notes on a nearby pad. When he hung up, his hands were shaking. "They found him," James whispered. "A horse retirement facility in Virginia. They've been trying to trace his history and came across my name in his military service records." "Shadow?" Sarah jumped up. "They found Shadow?" James nodded, already pulling up flight information on his phone. "He's been there for the past 2 years. They say he's healthy, but..." He paused, swallowing hard. "They say he hasn't bonded with anyone. Keeps to himself. Doesn't interact much with other horses or handlers." "When are we going?" Sarah asked, already knowing the answer. "Tomorrow," James replied, his voice firm. "I've waited 5 years. I'm not waiting another day." That night, James could barely sleep. He kept remembering their last day together, Shadow's gentle nudges, his intelligent eyes, the way he seemed to understand everything James said to him. He wondered if the horse would remember him, if their bond had survived the years of separation. Little did James know that the reunion would prove more extraordinary than he could imagine, and Shadow's reaction would leave everyone who witnessed it speechless. The early morning flight from Montana to Virginia felt endless to James. Sarah sat beside him, occasionally squeezing his hand when she noticed him tensing up. Through the small airplane window, they watched the landscape change from mountainous terrain to the green rolling hills of Virginia. Blue Creek Horse Haven, James read from the facility's website on his phone, specializing in retired service and therapy horses. The photos showed a well-maintained facility with spacious paddocks and modern stables. His heart caught when he saw a distant black horse in one of the images, though it was too blurry to be sure if it was Shadow. What if he's different? James voiced his concern to Sarah. 5 years is a long time. Sarah smiled reassuringly. Dad, you always said Shadow was special. That kind of bond doesn't just disappear. The facility's director, Dr. Maria Rodriguez, met them at the Richmond airport. A woman in her 50s with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair. She'd been caring for retired service animals for over 2 decades. Captain Mitchell. She greeted him warmly. When we finally traced Shadow's history through his military ID chip, I couldn't believe our luck. We've been trying to understand why such a magnificent horse seemed so withdrawn. During the drive to the facility, Dr. Rodriguez filled them in on Shadow's recent history. He came to us 2 years ago from a government training facility in Maryland. Physically, he's in excellent condition for his age, but emotionally, she paused, choosing her words carefully. He's been different from our other horses. Distant. The handlers say it's like he's waiting for someone. James stared out the window, his throat tight. The Virginia countryside rolled past, green and lush in the late spring sunshine. Has he let anyone ride him? No, Dr. Rodriguez replied. He tolerates basic care and grooming, but he's refused all attempts at riding. We eventually stopped trying. As they turned onto a tree-lined drive, the Blue Creek Horse Haven came into view. The facility spread across several hundred acres, with white fenced paddocks and neat red barns. Several horses grazed in the distance, their coats gleaming in the afternoon sun. We've kept him in our main stable, Dr. Rodriguez explained as they parked. He's more comfortable with his own space. James's hands trembled slightly as he got out of the car. Sarah stayed close, sensing his nervousness. They followed Dr. Rodriguez toward the largest barn, its doors open to catch the spring breeze. Before we go in, Dr. Rodriguez turned to them. I should mention that Shadow's been especially sensitive today. It's like he knows something's different. Our morning handler said he refused his breakfast and kept watching the driveway. Inside the barn, the air was cool and sweet with the smell of fresh hay. Several horses nickered softly in their stalls as they passed. At the far end, a large corner stall stood slightly apart from the others. James could make out a dark shape in the shadows. Shadow? Dr. Rodriguez called softly. You have visitors. The shape moved, and James caught his breath. A massive black head appeared in the stall window, proud and beautiful as James remembered. The white star on his chest gleamed like a beacon, but it was the eyes that stopped James in his tracks. Those same intelligent, expressive eyes he'd never forgotten. For a moment, nobody moved. Shadow stood perfectly still, his ears forward, nostrils flaring slightly as he caught James's scent. James took a tentative step forward, then another. Hey, old friend, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Remember me? What happened next left everyone in the barn speechless. Shadow's whole demeanor changed. His eyes, fixed on James, began to overflow with moisture. Clear drops rolled down his dark face, tears, unmistakable tears. The proud military horse began to tremble, making a soft, nickering sound that seemed to catch in his throat. Oh my God, Dr. Rodriguez breathed. I've never seen anything like this. Sarah grabbed her phone, instinctively recording his shadow pressed against the stall door, his eyes never leaving James. The horse's tears continued to flow as James reached out to touch his velvet nose. "I've missed you too, buddy," James said, his own eyes wet. "I've missed you so much." Shadow's reaction grew even more intense. He began to make a sound none of them had ever heard before, something between a nicker and a sob. Other handlers and staff members, drawn by the commotion, gathered at a respectful distance, watching in amazement as the usually reserved black horse openly displayed his emotion. Dr. Rodriguez quickly moved to unlock the stall door. "I think he needs to be closer to you," she said softly. As the door swung open, Shadow stepped forward with remarkable gentleness, pressing his tear-stained face against James's chest. James wrapped his arms around the horse's powerful neck, and man and horse stood together, reunited after 5 long years. "Dad," Sarah called softly, still recording. "He's crying like a person would. I've never seen a horse cry like this." Indeed, Shadow's tears continued to flow as he pressed closer to James, as if trying to make up for 5 years of lost contact in a single moment. The horse's body trembled with emotion, his usual stoic demeanor completely forgotten in the joy of reunion. The stable fell silent except for Shadow's soft, emotional sounds and James's quiet words of comfort. The horse's tears continued to fall, darkening his sleek black coat with moisture. Staff members watched in amazement as the usually reserved stallion displayed such profound emotion. "In 30 years of working with horses, I've never witnessed anything like this, Dar," Rodriguez whispered to Sarah, who was still recording. "We knew horses could form deep bonds, but this is extraordinary." James stood there, one hand gently stroking Shadow's neck, the other wiping his own tears away. "You knew I'd come back, didn't you, boy? You never gave up." Shadow's response was to press his head even closer, his large dark eyes still overflowing. The white star on his chest seemed to gleam as his powerful body trembled with emotion. Each time James tried to step back slightly, Shadow would follow, unwilling to allow even an inch of separation. "He hasn't let anyone this close since he arrived," one of the handlers commented. "Most days, we could barely approach him for basic care." Sarah slowly moved closer, her phone still recording. Shadow lifted his head slightly, acknowledging her presence while maintaining physical contact with James. His tears had slowed, but his eyes remained wet with emotion. "Hey, Shadow," she said softly. "I've heard so many stories about you." The horse nickered softly, reaching out to gently nuzzle her hand while keeping his body pressed against James. It was as if he recognized her as part of his long-lost family. Dr. Rodriguez brought out Shadow's medical records. "His behavior makes so much more sense now," she explained, showing James the notes. "He wasn't depressed or difficult. He was grieving, waiting, the way he would stand at his stall window for hours watching the driveway. He was looking for you." James could barely take his eyes off Shadow to look at the records. "How soon can I take him home?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "We'll need to process some paperwork, but given your history together and your facility's credentials, we can expedite everything," Dr. Rodriguez replied. "Would you like to take him to the outdoor arena? Let him stretch his legs with you?" James nodded, and Shadow's ears perked forward at the suggestion. The staff brought out a halter, but there was no need. Shadow followed James willingly, staying so close their shoulders touched. In the arena, the magnificent black horse seemed to come alive, his steps becoming lighter, more energetic. "Watch this," James said softly, stepping away from Shadow. "Shadow present." The horse immediately assumed a perfect military stance, head high, ears forward. Despite 5 years apart, he remembered their training perfectly. "At ease, boy," James called, and Shadow relaxed, trotting over to him with newfound energy. His eyes, though still wet with emotion, now sparkled with life. Sarah watched from the fence. "Dad, he moves like a much younger horse now," she observed. "It's like he's gotten his spirit back." Indeed, Shadow seemed transformed. Gone was the withdrawn, depressed horse the staff had known. In its place was a proud, energetic stallion, performing complex movements at the slightest gesture from James, stopping occasionally to press his head against his former partner's chest, as if reassuring himself that this wasn't a dream. Most retired military horses adapt to civilian life, Dr. Rodriguez explained to Sarah. But Shadow, it's like he never wanted to. He was holding on to something, or someone. As the afternoon progressed, Shadow's emotional display settled into what seemed like quiet joy. His tears had dried, but his eyes remained bright and focused on James. When other horses were led past the arena, Shadow paid them no attention. His world had narrowed to the human he'd waited 5 years to see again. James sat with Dr. Rodriguez to complete the adoption paperwork, but Shadow refused to be put back in his stall. He stood at the office window, occasionally pawing the ground if James moved out of his sight. "I've arranged transport for next week," James said, signing the final document. "That will give me time to prepare everything at home." Shadow's ears flicked forward at the word home, and he nickered softly through the window. "Actually," Dr. Rodriguez interjected, "given his strong reaction and the obvious bond between you, I'd recommend taking him sooner. We can arrange transport for tomorrow if you'd like. I think separating you two again, even for a week, might be traumatic for him." James looked up at Shadow's face in the window, seeing the anxiety in those expressive eyes at even this brief separation. "You're right," he agreed. "Sarah, can you change our return flights? We'll drive back with Shadow instead." Shadow's whole demeanor brightened at these words, and fresh tears appeared in his eyes. But these were different from before. These were tears of joy, of anticipation of a future restored. The next morning arrived with a gentle Virginia sunrise. The horse transport trailer that Dr. Rodriguez had arranged was larger and more comfortable than standard models, with extra padding and ventilation. Still, when the handlers approached Shadow with a lead rope, he grew anxious, his eyes darting between the trailer and James. "It's okay, buddy," James soothed, placing a gentle hand on Shadow's neck. "We're going home together. I'm not leaving you again." Understanding seemed to flash in Shadow's dark eyes. Without hesitation, he followed James to the trailer, though he paused at the ramp, his ears twitching nervously. "Dad," Sarah suggested, "maybe if you go in first?" James nodded and stepped into the trailer. Shadow immediately followed, pressing close behind him. The horse's behavior was unprecedented. Typically, military horses were trained to load and travel independently. "He's afraid of being separated again," Dr. Rodriguez observed. "I'd recommend you ride in the trailer with him, Captain Mitchell. We can make adjustments for safety." The transport company quickly modified the setup, creating a secure seating area for James within Shadow's sight. Sarah would follow in their rental car. As the staff secured the trailer, Shadow remained unusually calm, his eyes fixed on James, occasionally reaching out to touch him with his muzzle, as if reassuring himself that his human was still there. "The journey to Montana will take about 3 days," the transport driver explained. "We'll make regular stops for rest and exercise." As they prepared to leave, the staff of Blue Creek Horse Haven gathered to say goodbye. Many had tears in their eyes, moved by the extraordinary reunion they'd witnessed. Shadow acknowledged them with gentle nickers, a stark contrast to his previously withdrawn behavior. The journey west became a testament to the deep bond between horse and rider. At each rest stop, Shadow would exit the trailer calmly as long as James was nearby. The moment James stepped away, even briefly, the horse would become agitated, his eyes welling up with tears until his human returned. During their first overnight stop in Illinois, the stable owner came out to watch Shadow being unloaded. "Never seen anything like it," he commented as Shadow pressed his head against James's shoulder, tears flowing freely again. "Horses can be emotional, sure, but this is different." Sarah captured these moments on her phone, documenting their journey home. "It's like he's making up for lost time," she observed as Shadow refused to eat unless James was sitting near his stall. Every moment you're out of his sight, he thinks he might lose you again. The second day took them through Iowa and South Dakota. At each stop, word had somehow spread about the crying horse and his veteran, drawing small crowds of onlookers. Shadow remained focused solely on James, his previous military training evident in how he positioned himself between his human and any approaching strangers. On the final day, as they crossed into Montana, Shadow became increasingly alert. Though he'd never been to the ranch, something about the mountain air and open spaces seemed to speak to him. His ears perked forward, and his nickering took on an excited tone. "Almost home, boy," James said softly, watching the familiar landscape roll past. "Just a few more hours." When they finally turned onto the long driveway of the Veterans Equine Therapy Ranch, Shadow's energy was palpable. The moment the trailer door opened, he stepped out with newfound purpose, his head high as he surveyed his new home. The tears that had been his constant companion during the journey were replaced by an alert, almost proud expression. The ranch staff had prepared a special stall in the main barn, extra large and facing the mountains. But as they approached the barn, Shadow planted his feet firmly, refusing to go inside. His eyes, still damp with emotion, fixed on the paddock adjacent to the house, the one James had kept empty all these years. "I think he's choosing his own spot," Sarah laughed, watching as Shadow gently but firmly led James toward the private paddock. James understood. "That's right, buddy. That space was always meant for you." As twilight settled over the Montana ranch, Shadow stood in his new paddock, his black coat gleaming in the fading light. Every few minutes, he would look toward the house where James sat on the porch, as if making sure his human was still there. Occasionally, a tear would roll down his face, but these were different from the overwhelming emotions of their reunion. These were tears of contentment, of finally being home. The other therapy horses in the nearby paddocks watched with interest as Shadow settled in. They seemed to sense something special about this new arrival, this proud black stallion who cried like a human and watched the house with such devotion. That night, James found himself unable to sleep, drawn to the window that overlooked Shadow's paddock. In the moonlight, he could see the horse standing alert, his gaze fixed on the house. Their eyes met through the window, and Shadow nickered softly, a sound that seemed to say, "I'm still here. We're together again." The first few weeks at the ranch revealed new dimensions to Shadow's remarkable nature. While he remained deeply attached to James, his emotional intelligence began to extend to others, particularly the veterans who came to the ranch for therapy. One morning, as James was reviewing files in the ranch office, Sarah burst in excitedly. "Dad, you need to see this." Outside, a scene was unfolding that would become the first of many extraordinary moments. Mike Henderson, a young veteran who hadn't spoken since returning from his last deployment, was standing in Shadow's paddock. The black stallion had approached him carefully, and to everyone's amazement, tears were streaming down Shadow's face as he gently nuzzled the troubled veteran's shoulder. Mike, who had resisted connecting with any of the other therapy horses, reached up with a trembling hand to touch Shadow's muzzle. Then, for the first time in months, he spoke. "You understand, don't you?" His voice was barely a whisper. "You've been through it too." James watched from a distance, not wanting to interrupt the moment. Shadow's behavior was unlike anything he'd seen before, even during their military service. The horse seemed to instinctively recognize emotional pain in others, and his own capacity to cry appeared to give permission for these tough veterans to express their own emotions. "It's like he's showing them it's okay to feel," Sarah observed, recording another session where Shadow worked with a female veteran struggling with PTSD. The horse had approached her carefully, his eyes welling up as she told her story, his tears matching hers. The ranch's therapeutic program had to be modified to accommodate Shadow's unique abilities. While the other therapy horses were excellent at their jobs, Shadow possessed an extraordinary empathy that made him especially effective with the most traumatized veterans. Dr. Maria Rodriguez flew in from Virginia to observe this phenomenon. "This goes beyond normal equine therapy," she noted, watching Shadow interact with a group session. He's not just responding to human emotions. He's actively demonstrating emotional understanding in a way that breaks down barriers for these veterans. The only challenge was Shadow's continued anxiety about separation from James. While he would work with other veterans, he needed to know where James was at all times. If James left the ranch for any reason, Shadow would stand at the fence, tears flowing until he returned. "We need to help him feel secure," James decided after one particularly difficult separation. "He needs to know that leaving doesn't mean leaving forever." They developed a routine. Before James had to leave the ranch, he would go to Shadow's paddock and explain where he was going and when he'd return. Despite being a horse, Shadow seemed to understand these conversations. His goodbye tears became less anxious and more accepting. One remarkable incident occurred during a severe thunderstorm. A group of veterans had taken shelter in the barn, including several who struggled with storm-related triggers. Shadow broke away from his paddock, something he'd never done before, and made his way to the barn. There, he positioned himself among the veterans, his tears flowing as the thunder crashed, sharing their fear rather than trying to calm it. "He's not just offering comfort," one of the ranch's therapists observed. "He's showing them they're not alone in their feelings." The story of the crying therapy horse began to spread. Various news outlets contacted the ranch, wanting to document this extraordinary phenomenon. James was protective of both Shadow and their veterans, allowing only limited coverage that wouldn't disrupt the healing work they were doing. Scientists and animal behaviorists visited, amazed by Shadow's ability to cry real tears in response to emotional situations. While horses could produce tears for eye lubrication, Shadow's emotional crying was unprecedented. "There's still so much we don't understand about animal consciousness," one researcher commented after observing Shadow comfort a grieving veteran with his own tears. "This horse is challenging everything we thought we knew about animal emotional expression." Through it all, Shadow's bond with James remained paramount. Each evening, after the therapy sessions were done, horse and human would spend quiet time together in the paddock. Sometimes Shadow would cry softly, pressing his head against James's chest, as if still making up for their years apart. "I think he cries for different reasons now," Sarah told her father one evening as they watched Shadow greeting the sunset with his usual quiet dignity. Before, his tears were from loss and loneliness. Now they're his way of connecting, of showing others they're not alone. James nodded, understanding. Shadow had transformed from a war horse to something even more valuable, a healer who could bridge the gap between human pain and animal comfort in a way no one had seen before. The Black Stallion's reputation grew among military veterans. Some traveled hundreds of miles just to spend time with the horse who could cry with them, who understood their pain in a way that even human therapists sometimes couldn't match. Winter came early to Montana that year, bringing with it a challenge that would test both Shadow and the entire ranch community. One particularly harsh November morning, the ranch received an urgent call about a group of veterans stranded at a remote cabin during a hunting trip. Among them was Mike Henderson, the young veteran who had first connected with Shadow months earlier. The news hit the ranch hard. The veterans were trapped by an unexpected blizzard, and standard rescue vehicles couldn't reach them. The Highway Patrol's helicopters were grounded due to the severe weather conditions. James, with his military experience and knowledge of the terrain, volunteered to join the rescue effort. But for the first time since their reunion, he would have to leave Shadow behind in conditions too dangerous for horses. When James went to explain the situation to Shadow, the horse's reaction was unprecedented. Instead of his usual separation anxiety, Shadow became intensely agitated, pulling at his lead rope and focusing on the mountain trail visible from his paddock. His tears, rather than being sorrowful, seemed urgent. "Dad," Sarah said, watching Shadow's behavior, "I think he knows something's wrong. Look at how he's acting. It's different from his usual separation anxiety." James hesitated, remembering similar behavior from their military days when Shadow had sensed danger his human handlers hadn't yet detected. The horse's instincts had saved lives more than once. Shadow was trained for mountain terrain in Afghanistan, James mused, watching his horse paw at the ground impatiently. And he has incredible night vision. The rescue coordinator, initially skeptical, listened as James explained Shadow's military background and unique abilities. With time running out and no other options available, they agreed to let Shadow join the rescue effort, equipped with emergency supplies. The moment Shadow understood he would be going with James, his demeanor changed completely. The nervous tears stopped, replaced by an alert, focused expression that James remembered from their military days. This was Shadow the war horse again, ready for a mission. They set out as the storm intensified, Shadow moving surely through the deepening snow. While other horses might have panicked in the harsh conditions, Shadow seemed to draw on his military training, carefully picking his way along treacherous mountain paths. He's following something, James realized as Shadow deviated from the planned route, his ears forward and nostrils flaring. Despite the whiteout conditions, the horse moved with purpose, leading them through paths that somehow avoided the worst of the storm. After what seemed like hours, Shadow suddenly stopped, his ears twitching. Through the howling wind, James heard what his horse had already detected: faint calls for help. Shadow had led them straight to the stranded cabin, choosing a path that the rescue teams hadn't even known existed. The scene inside the cabin was dire. The veterans, including Mike, were suffering from the cold, their supplies running low. When they heard Shadow's distinct nicker outside, Mike's face lit up with recognition. "I knew you'd come," he whispered when Shadow stuck his head through the cabin door, tears freezing on the horse's face as he surveyed the trapped men. The rescue became a coordinated effort, with Shadow making multiple trips to help transport supplies and guide additional rescue teams to the location. Throughout the night, he worked tirelessly, his tears freezing in the brutal wind, but his determination never wavering. Most remarkable was his interaction with the hypothermic veterans. Between trips, Shadow would press his warm body against them, his tears flowing as he shared their distress, somehow understanding the gravity of the situation. By dawn, when the storm finally began to ease, all the veterans had been safely evacuated. Shadow, exhausted but still alert, made one final check of the cabin with James, as if ensuring no one had been left behind. The return to the ranch was triumphant, but Shadow's work wasn't done. As the rescued veterans recovered in the ranch's medical facility, he visited each one, offering his unique comfort. His tears, which had frozen during the rescue, now flowed freely again, but these were tears of relief and healing. "He mourns with us, celebrates with us, and now he saves us," Mike said, watching Shadow move from bed to bed, checking on each veteran. How do you explain a creature like that? The story of Shadow's rescue made national news, bringing attention to both his extraordinary emotional capacity and his continued service to veterans. Military animal behavior experts arrived to study how his combination of combat training and emotional intelligence had made the rescue possible. But perhaps the most significant change was in Shadow himself. The successful rescue seemed to heal something in him, a final piece of his military service honored. His separation anxiety when James left the ranch eased significantly, though his tears remained as expressive as ever. "I think he needed this," Sarah observed, watching Shadow stand proudly in his paddock the day after the rescue. "He needed to know he could still serve, still protect." James agreed, recognizing that Shadow had found a perfect balance between his military past and his new role as a healer. The tears that had once been signs of trauma and separation had transformed into tools of connection and service. In the months following the dramatic mountain rescue, Shadow's story sparked a revolution in equine therapy programs nationwide. The ranch became a center for studying the deeper emotional capabilities of horses, with Shadow as the extraordinary example of what was possible. Dr. Rodriguez, who had first witnessed Shadow's emotional display in Virginia, established a permanent research program at the ranch. "What we're learning from Shadow is changing our entire understanding of animal consciousness," she explained to a group of visiting veterinary students. His ability to not only recognize but share in human emotional experiences goes beyond anything previously documented. One spring morning, as James watched Shadow working with a group of veterans, he noticed something remarkable. The horse was teaching them his own form of emotional expression. When one veteran struggled to verbalize his trauma, Shadow demonstrated how to release those feelings, his tears flowing freely until the man finally broke down and allowed himself to cry. "He's showing them it's okay to be vulnerable," Sarah observed, documenting these sessions for the research program. These tough military men and women see this powerful war horse crying, and it gives them permission to do the same. The ranch expanded its programs to accommodate the growing interest. They built a special observation area where therapeutic professionals could study Shadow's methods without disturbing the veterans he worked with. His influence began changing how therapy animals were selected and trained across the country. One particularly moving moment came when a group of military working dog handlers visited the ranch. These handlers, who understood the deep bonds formed with animal partners in combat, connected with Shadow on a unique level. The horse seemed to recognize them as kindred spirits, sharing tears that spoke of both the joy and pain of service. "He remembers," one handler said, watching Shadow demonstrate the precise military commands he still remembered, "just like our dogs. He carries both the pride and the weight of his service." The science community remained fascinated by Shadow's ability to cry real emotional tears. Research papers were published about his unique physiology, but more importantly, about the therapeutic impact of his emotional displays. Studies showed that veterans who worked with Shadow had significantly higher recovery rates than those in traditional therapy programs. James was careful to balance the research interest with Shadow's well-being and the privacy of their veterans. He established strict guidelines. Shadow's interaction with veterans always came first, and research activities could never interfere with the therapeutic work. The horse seemed to understand his expanded role. While he maintained his deep bond with James, his emotional connections with others grew stronger and more nuanced. He developed different types of tears for different situations. Quiet tears of companionship when working with grieving veterans, urgent tears when sensing someone in emotional crisis, and joyful tears when witnessing breakthrough moments in therapy. One of the most significant developments came when Shadow began working with veterans' families, particularly children struggling to understand their parents' PTSD. His gentle approach and expressive tears helped bridge the communication gap between traumatized parents and their confused children. "Daddy's hurting like Shadow sometimes hurts," one young girl explained to her mother after watching the horse cry during her father's therapy session. "But Shadow shows us it's okay to hurt and heal together." The ranch started a special program for military families, with Shadow at its center. His ability to demonstrate emotional processing became a powerful tool for family healing. He showed children that their parents' emotional struggles weren't scary or shameful, but part of a healing journey. Mike Henderson, now fully recovered from the mountain rescue, became a regular volunteer at the ranch. He often shared his story with new veterans, explaining how Shadow's tears had broken through his own emotional walls. "This horse taught me that strength isn't about holding everything in," he would tell them, standing beside Shadow in the paddock where they'd first connected. "Real strength is being brave enough to let it out." As Shadow's influence grew, James noticed subtle changes in the other therapy horses at the ranch. While none developed Shadow's ability to cry, they seemed to learn from his emotional openness, becoming more demonstrative in their interactions with veterans. "He's not just helping humans," Sarah noted, reviewing years of footage she'd collected. "He's teaching other horses how to connect on a deeper level." The ranch began receiving requests from military and veterans organizations worldwide, asking for guidance in developing more emotionally attuned therapy programs. Shadow's legacy was extending far beyond the mountains of Montana, changing how people understood both animal emotions and human healing. Through it all, Shadow maintained his evening ritual with James, sharing quiet moments in his paddock as the sun set behind the mountains. His tears during these times were different, soft, peaceful drops that seemed to express contentment rather than sorrow or empathy. "You've created something remarkable," Sarah told her father one evening as they watched Shadow greeting some new therapy horses. "You gave him the chance to transform his trauma into healing, not just for himself but for hundreds of others." 5 years after Shadow's remarkable reunion with James, the ranch had evolved into a nationally recognized center for innovative trauma healing. On a crisp autumn morning, similar to the day Shadow first arrived, the ranch prepared to celebrate a special milestone: the graduation of their 1,000th veteran from the therapy program. The ceremony was intentionally small, respecting the private nature of their work. Veterans who had been touched by Shadow's gift gathered in the main paddock, many accompanied by their families. Shadow, now showing slight touches of gray around his muzzle but still carrying himself with military precision, stood beside James as they welcomed their guests. Among the attendees was Dr. Rodriguez, who had documented Shadow's journey from the beginning. "What we've witnessed here goes beyond therapy," she addressed the gathering. "Shadow has shown us that emotional healing isn't just a human journey. It's a connection that transcends species." Mike Henderson, now serving as the ranch's program director, shared his story with the group. "5 years ago, I couldn't speak, couldn't cry. Then this extraordinary horse taught me that tears aren't weakness. They're proof that we're alive, that we feel, that we're healing." As if understanding the significance of the moment, Shadow moved through the crowd, stopping to acknowledge each veteran he had worked with. His tears flowed freely, but they were different now, proud, joyful tears that celebrated their collective journey of healing. The most touching moment came when a young girl, daughter of one of the first veterans Shadow had helped, approached him with a hand-drawn picture. It showed Shadow with blue tears falling from his eyes, but these tears turned into butterflies as they reached the ground. "Because your tears help people fly again?" she explained, as Shadow gently nuzzled her hair, his own tears falling softly. James watched this interaction, remembering the traumatized war horse who had arrived at the ranch years ago. Shadow's journey from broken warrior to healer had inspired a new understanding of both animal consciousness and human recovery. The research program had documented over 50 distinct types of emotional tears from Shadow, each corresponding to different therapeutic situations. His ability to match his emotional expression to exactly what each veteran needed had revolutionized animal-assisted therapy protocols worldwide. During the ceremony, Sarah presented a documentary she had crafted over the years, showing Shadow's evolution and the countless lives he had touched. The footage captured remarkable moments: Shadow crying in sync with veterans as they shared their trauma, his tears of joy when they achieved breakthroughs, his gentle tears when working with children, and his proud tears during graduation ceremonies. "Shadow hasn't just helped veterans," Sarah narrated. "He's shown us a new way to understand emotional healing. His tears remind us that it's our shared vulnerability that makes us strong." As the ceremony concluded, something unexpected happened. The other therapy horses on the ranch gathered at their paddock fences, and one by one, they began displaying new behaviors of emotional expression. While none could cry like Shadow, they had developed their own ways of showing empathy and connection. "He's created a legacy," Dr. Rodriguez observed. "These horses are learning from him, developing their own emotional language. It's evolution happening before our eyes." The day ended with a quiet moment between Shadow and James in their favorite spot, watching the Montana sunset. Shadow's tears fell softly as he pressed his head against James's shoulder, just as he had done countless times before. "You've done so much, old friend," James whispered. "You've helped so many find their way home." Shadow's response was a gentle nicker and a few more tears that seemed to hold all the wisdom and healing he had shared over the years. The ranch would continue to grow and evolve, but Shadow's gift remained its heart. His unique ability to cry had opened a new chapter in understanding both animal emotions and human healing. More importantly, he had shown that sometimes the bravest act is simply being willing to share another's pain, to cry together, and to find strength in shared vulnerability. As darkness fell over the ranch, Shadow stood tall in his paddock, his tears reflecting the starlight. He was no longer just a war horse who could cry, but a symbol of hope and healing, a reminder that even the deepest wounds could become wellsprings of connection and understanding.